Hello, hello. My name is Brooke. I'm from the Graphite marketing team. Today we had a broadcast with the Hackett Group covering the CoE, and we accidentally had a little bit of a technical difficulty. So we missed the first 10 minutes of recording for the webinar. So I am here to intro the webinar and cover the content that we discussed in those first 10 minutes, and then I'll let the regularly scheduled programming kick back up with the recording with Kate and Callie. So here we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the Next Gen CoE Playbook from Value Add to Strategic Powerhouse. I am Brooke Smith from the Graphite Connect marketing team, and I'm so glad you're here with us today. Before we jump in, I want to cover a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We wanted this session to be pretty interactive, so throughout the webinar, we encouraged attendees to participate through the chat, Q&A, and raise hand functions. We also included a few polls along the way to gather perspectives from the audience in real time. We're especially excited about today's conversation because it has been one of the most highly anticipated topics that we've hosted. And interest in centers of excellence and the future of procurement transformation is clearly top of mind right now. I'm also very excited to be joined by Kate Denissova from the Hackett Group. Kate brings deep experience helping procurement leaders transform their organizations into more strategic, data-driven, and business-aligned functions. In this session, she'll share insights from Hackett's research on how procurement is evolving, how AI and analytics are reshaping the function, and what next generation of CoEs will need to deliver to be successful. With that, let's jump into the conversation. We'll be cutting into the first polling question, which was investment focus and seeing where people are prioritizing their investments. So kicking it over to Kate and to Callie, my coworker who helped moderate the session.
When we compare the investment in talent and training, procurement compared to other functions, they're far behind other like finance, HR, and others. So I think we're moving in the right directions where procurement is finally realizing that, hey, talent management is important. So let's hope it stays there because the skills of the future are needed, and the ways of working is changing significantly.
And Kate, one of the things that we're hearing a lot more from our own customers here at Graphite is that they're also really investing in how do we get people who not just understand AI, they almost act like product managers, where they're now, instead of going out and buying AI tools to support procurement functions, and it might be a combination, it might not be an instead of, it might be in addition to buying tools. They're also thinking about what can we build internally, right? If we can't go out and layer on 8 different LLMs because of security reasons or governance reasons internally, they're thinking about how can I leverage my corporate Gemini? How can I leverage my, Glean, a customer of ours, I know is using Glean a lot internally to build their own internal AI agents that can support the business, which I thought was interesting. I have another question here. Are any best practices emerging for getting deeper tiers of supplier data to power a procurement function? Supply chains generate a staggering amount of transactional and forecast data. That's challenging enough, but then you have to address the added challenge that most of this data sits in external systems within suppliers. Maybe unified platforms like Graphite, ESG compliance reporting data, AI, others.
Well, I think this is where we're getting into a question of like orchestration, right? So, and which ties into the question around build versus buy, right? That came up. Then that we're hearing a lot. Should we build or should we buy? Well, it's a combination of both, right? And and I think, well, I didn't come up with this, but it's the approach that how we should talk about the decision build versus buy is really about how we think about our workforce, right? Mm-hmm. Some we hire, some we grow, train, some we hire consultants, right? So we rent them, right? But the question about orchestration now, it's a must-have. So we need to have that orchestration layer that interacts with a lot of these tools and systems and agents, right? When we're getting into that space of kind of multi-agentic environment and also the complexity with data that we're seeing. That's a very good question and very, very relevant right now.
Absolutely.
Any other questions?
No, I think we can keep going.
Okay. So I know this is an eye chart, but really I think just wanted to highlight the area that's in the pink here on the bottom right, where we're looking at these critical development areas that are very low in maturity, but very high in importance. And some of the things that we're seeing is master data management, right? It's highlighted as organizations identified, we need to be better and stronger in this, but we're currently very immature. We talked about supplier innovation as well, right? We're very immature, but we need to scale that up. Supplier performance management, SRM, AI-enabled technology, agentic, right? So all of these areas. So if you're thinking about from the CoE roadmap perspective, right? What were the areas you should be, focusing on and really kind of highlighting that kind of the top priority areas. And again, we're seeing AI as a separate bucket here or separate bubble, right? We need to think about it. It's completely embedded and woven in everything that we do. And it was interesting. And we actually highlighted this during our event last week. We had our Hackett Leadership Forum with all of our clients joining, and we showed a picture of this from last year where this bubble was all the way to the left. Right? And then we've highlighted that this is it was one of our North American leaders highlighted that, he's been here like over 20 years, and he said this is the fastest he's seen a bubble move from one side of the quadrant to another within a year or 2 year span. So again, things are moving very quickly, and that's where that concept of velocity, agility is coming in and to enable our decision making, right? And we can't do that without good quality information and data. So as you're thinking about your CoEs, I would look at this chart and see where do you stand on this, right? How are your capabilities, right? And then try to think through of, okay, well, what would be my focus for next couple of months or a year? So when we're talking about the service placement of key procurement processes, right? I'm going to highlight SRM, supplier relationship, supplier information management, supplier performance, risk management. All of these areas, right, traditionally would sit within centers of excellence, right? But what we're seeing right now, they're still often kind of buried within your corporate procurement functions or the the business unit. So I think this integration is great, but the idea of the center of excellence is really trying to create the transformational elements, right? Because a lot of times if you have what I call pockets of excellence within your, category management, that's great that it's being done, but it often gets stale. So you want to make sure you're constantly innovating. And that's where the CoE comes in with the ability to have a forward-looking perspective.
Kate, there's a really relevant question Mark brought up here. We seem to be wrestling a bit with IT on AI agent capability development. Is there a best practice related to the CoE-driven agent development versus IT built?
So, if you have a capability if you have capabilities within your CoE to do that, and that's why a lot of organizations that had historically data and analytics teams, they've kind of matured into more of a agentic team, right? So I think it doesn't matter where it gets built as long as it's done correctly and as long as you have the proper governance around it, right? And the skill set, right? I think the idea of having a CoE factory to build your agents for procurement sounds amazing to me, as long as you can put that governance around it. But also not everyone has, the budgets to do that. Other organizations, if you don't have that, you rely on your enterprise IT to do that.
Yeah, it's almost like you sometimes, Kate, need like a racy chart though to think through. Like if you're building it, if your COE is owning AI agents, maybe, if responsible, accountable, contributing, informed, like IT is definitely going to be more in the mix, I think, in a lot of organizations if they have that maturity where they're building a lot internally themselves. I'm curious, like we talk about, you mentioned pockets of excellence and centers of excellence, which I think is really interesting because center of excellence is like the center of what? Is it the center of your procurement or is it the center of your excellence for your business entirely, right? Because are they expected to be the conduit to IT and the conduit to finance? Is that the model that works best for a COE?
Yeah, so I think you're the transformational center of excellence, right? The transformational function of procurement, right? They would be responsible to connecting the dots and driving that cross-functional activities. The question around, who's responsible for building agents, IT or procurement, that fundamentally is really the core of the build versus buy, right? And having that right governance in place that you want to make sure you have.
There's a question on this slide. Alan asked, seeing that the PO processing and tactical sourcing are done through a COE, does that mean that they're automated or are they done through self-service tools?
So PO processing and management, COE service placement is really getting started as like an early maturity, right? When you have a maybe less of a mature procurement organization, less of a mature of a, COE, and you're just trying to wrap your hands around driving that centralization. So that could be, a combination of automation, or it could be manual activities. But this is kind of the level 0 of maturity of COEs. When you're trying to take it out of the business and kind of drive it in a more central way, when you're trying to stand up your central-led or centralized procurement.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think a lot of those, the PO processing and management, because there's so much localization that, understanding of the local suppliers, regional suppliers, if you're doing, it's interesting. I would anticipate that 28% of the business unit owning it will start moving, start squeezing in a lot more. We'll start seeing more of those centers of excellence helping to drive, even if finance owns a lot of the PO processing and AP owns a lot of the PO processing, the COE helping to drive. What does that process look like on a global scale? What does that look like across multiple business units? And what are the things that we can do to make everyone more efficient across the board? And again, even the data to do that, right? You need a good vendor master. You need high quality, understanding of who your suppliers are. And that can be driven by the COE in a really meaningful way.
Yeah. And eventually, kind of once you mature or incubate your PO processing and management within COE, then you can move it out and put it into like GBS or global business services, or eventually, outsource it based on whatever your strategy is. But COE in that respect is kind of the first level of maturity. And then we also see over here, like strategic category management, contract negotiations, source and execution. Those are also some of that delivery COE that we see emerge in the earlier stage, right? So again, you kind of started with supporting, okay, how do I support the PO processing? Then how do I support the contract negotiation? Maybe you do it by actually delivering it, and then eventually the business is able to do it themselves.
This is interesting clarity on some definitions here. I think there's confusion in roles. Do you agree with this definition? COE sets the rules and the tools. Category managers define the strategy. Delivery executes and embeds within the business.
So depends on a COE type, right? So if we're talking about a knowledge COE, right? A lot of times if you're coming in and you're standing up COE within, if you don't have a mature category management and negotiations, right? And your COE will bring that toolkit, those playbooks for category management, right? To do that. If you do have a mature category management, then COE is really more of that knowledge center and enabling, right? They're going to you and saying, what do you need how can we help you to do your, category management strategy definition better? But if you're not mature in it, then they're coming to you and saying, here's the receipt, here's the template, here's how you do it. Or they show it to you, or they're incubating that function within a COE and then putting it back.
Mm-hmm. Another quick question here. Accounts payable usually owns the vendor master. How does AP then fit into this new model if there's a separate CoE?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
I think I would envision how we see some customers doing it is there's a, CoE partners, again, like more of a racy chart where they partner with AP teams. I think it really depends on the organization. We have a customer, Ancestry, for example. It's been a customer of ours for a really long time, and their procurement lead owns AP as well. The finance team actually does not, he owns shared services. He owns almost more like a GBS, like a global business services. And so AP reports into him. And so, but he is ultimately the procurement leader that owns that vendor master. In other organizations, it gets way messier, I think, in a lot of ways, because everyone, again, vendor master, what is the vendor master? What is the data you really need as that source of truth? The commercials, yeah, AP tends to own that. But for a CoE, if you're doing strategic sourcing, you might not be even thinking about the vendor master per se. But there's other details you need from the supplier data set that you operate under that fits that umbrella.
Yeah. And we also want to understand what the scope of activities of CoE, right? So we talked about the placement. I do have a slide around kind of the different levels of maturities that we can cover. But in terms of the CoE that is strategic, kind of next generation CoE that is there to enable the value delivery of the category managers, of strategic sourcing, of the negotiators, right? So really we're looking at what can CoE provide to do that, right? How do we support supplier negotiations while we're providing the data and reporting and insights? We're anticipating what's needed from a negotiation perspective, and then we're delivering that data, right? The same thing with strategic sourcing, right? Demand management, right? Cost modeling. So all of these tools that procurement needs, Center of Excellence would be a delivery mechanism for that in the next generation environment, right? But sometimes if they're just on a path of maturity, CoE might be doing some of these activities as well, right? So it really depends on the maturity of your organization and how you're structured.
Yeah. We have a really great question. I think that maybe tease off that AP question from earlier. I think this is from Mark. He says, I think scope alignment and sponsorship of your CoE is most important to avoid internal clashes. Do most CoEs that you see have charters that they align with, or do they have a steering committee that helps determine priorities cross-functionally?
Well, it ties into procurement strategy, right? So if your CoE is a transformational muscle, then, the strategy will identify the stakeholders and highlight, okay, who do we need to engage, right? And that is your internal stakeholders, right? It's your head of HR, it's your head of IT, right? Your finance leaders, right? And those are the key stakeholders that you're engaging with to drive and support your procurement organization's improvements.
I think what's interesting, Kate, is if I remember correctly from that very first slide where you had your pyramid, that beautiful pyramid, that negotiation and sourcing and category management and maybe even contracts were all in that lower tier of AI enablement, right? So the importance of the CoE in determining AI roadmap and strategy and how is that going to play in seems just so highly relevant here.
Yeah. Yeah. And then again, when we looked at that slide, right, where that bottom of the period around negotiations, sourcing, contracting, it's getting enabled, but CoEs are the architects of that, right? The data analytics. So the folks that are in that transformational arm, they would be responsible for driving transformation, right? So you can call it digital office of digital transformation or CoE, and right, whatever we want to come up with it. But the main goal of it is to drive change and transformation and enable procurement to work at the tip of the pyramid, right? So that's kind of what we're thinking about it. And we're right at the slide around the role of COE.
I teed you up perfectly.
Yeah. So again, so change management. So a lot of times people say, well, how do we implement change? We did ERPs, we did source to Ps, and it was so hard. Well, I think the biggest element that's missing is the stakeholder management and engagement, right? This is the soft and fuzzy part of the CoE work, right? We want to make sure that we also address it, because the more and more activities are being automated, the more and more we're going to need to talk with our stakeholders, right? Now, we now have time to do that, right? Because we're done sitting, putting together 100 pages decks for, weeks and months at a time. We can do it instantly, right? So now we can do that, right? Identifying stakeholders, analyze them, determining the strategies that are appropriate to them, right? And doing the action planning specifically, right? And again, that is what part of the CoE mandate will be, is to have that change management element within its, we want to call it data analytics teams or Gen AI teams or transformation teams, whatever we call them, right? So again, that is a very important capability of the future CoE. And I think also talent, right? So talent is another piece that goes hand in hand with this, now that we're finally paying attention to talent. So again, things that CoEs are driving, right? Technology adoption, any type of M&A activities, any reorgs, right? We're talking cultural transformation, process redesign, right? So like the concept of process ownership and process architect, right? And really start thinking about it, not from the steps of how to get somewhere, but really around the outcome. What outcome are we trying to achieve? And then having that process redesign. And that is, when procurement is focusing on day to day, our transformational CoEs are looking into the future of what are we going to do? How we're going to accomplish, right? So again, very important element of that.
Yeah, I think, Kate, one real success story that I spoke with one of our customers here at Graphite, Air Liquide, recently, and they brought Graphite in to be kind of that central data hub that cleans their data, because they had almost 40 ERPs globally, right? And that was because they had gone through mergers and acquisitions. They were very M&A heavy for a really long time. And I mean, when I tell you the number of ERPs, like, can you imagine if you're IT sitting in the middle of all that, trying to do global business services, or you're trying to do data management, master data management on a global scale, when you have that many different sources of truth, which I like to say, like, if you have more than one source of truth, you kind of have no source of truth, right? But it's interesting, because it's like, this is a business reality that then created a business challenge for them, just based off of like, hey, this is great. It's a positive. The business is growing. We're changing. But it did take a CoE to come in, and it was IT, and it was finance, and then it was regional business unit heads, leaders, and then procurement, all coming together to say, this is something we have to change. And risk, I should also say, risk and compliance was a piece of that as well. Yeah. So who owned that project? Well, everyone did. It was, it was a group together that said, no one owns, there's very few people who own the entirety of a merger or an acquisition. But when you have that many different companies coming together and that many different business units, you really need that global kind of mothership approach to how are we going to organize this. Otherwise, you're going to create data chaos among your teams, which ultimately leads to a lot of inefficiency globally, right? So I think that's a really interesting one that people often overlook, is thinking through high growth and to your point on like the VUCA environment, mergers, acquisitions. It feels like the pace is picking up globally. I know in the procurement space it is. Everyone sees the news every week about a procurement tech software getting acquired by another big player in the space. It does seem to be like this is an area where CoEs can have a major impact in making those mergers successful, and creating those processes and operations that really add that value that procurement needs to add.
Yeah. And it really should be that muscle. CoE should be that muscle for resiliency and agility, right?
Yes.
So as like the VUCA world changes, we're shifting and pivoting based on what's needed, right? And that also brings in the talent, right? We need to staff it with a talent that's capable of that kind of shifting as we go,
Yep.
right? So you need to have a core group that, that is capable of doing that and giving them resources, right? And really the access to insights, right? So you can make the decisions quicker and more in a more educated way, right? Being able to structure hypotheses, because we don't know what's going to happen next, right? But we can make a hypothesis. We can have deductive, inductive reasoning. And to do that, we need good data. But yeah, I think CoEs are great, and, we can call them whatever we want to call them, but I think the next generation of those individuals are going to be extremely important in driving the changes that we're seeing and supporting that dynamic environment. So let's just start with maybe take a look at some of the common CoE activities, right? So analytics, performance management, and then you have a laundry list of other things. There's market intelligence. There is some of the, kind of tactical buying, but really just if you look at the dark blue, right? No need to kind of read through it. You see that mainly these activities are, analytics, performance management, knowledge management. They're currently in place, right? But then we start looking at things that are being piloted or planning to evaluate. That's the light blue towards the bottom, right? So your Gen AI, innovation, brand and marketing, right? Enabling new technologies. So again, we want to start looking at we've already incubated these dark blue activities for the most part, right? Some we definitely want to continue holding on to, right? If we're allowed to, if our governance and enterprise structure allows us to do that, right? But then also introducing the light blue areas that organizations are planning, evaluating, so we can get to the the next level of maturity. And when we look at the maturity of specifically the analytics capabilities, right? We have some that are descriptive, right? When we're talking about what happened, right? Some are diagnostic. So why did it happen? But the next level is really looking at what will happen. How do we make it happen? So again, if you're reflecting on your current, when you're reflecting on your current one, would love to kind of understand where are you right now, right? And we just have the poll going, right? Where is your organization leveraging these capabilities? And then start thinking about in the future, right? Where should we be and how should we get there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting from the poll results so far. There's a lot of definitely it's almost like a pyramid, right? that descriptive analytics is popping up as people respond here. That it's definitely the what happened is the primary. That's that number one. That number two is the diagnostic insights, the why it happened. And then that the emerging predictive capabilities is third, and that advanced prescriptive is fourth. Is that how you normally see it happening, Kate?
I think right now we're kind of living in that space, but eventually it's going to shift, right? So again, organizations that are really, really good at that prescriptive and predictive, it's less than 10% of most organizations, right? Yeah. Well, here it shows 5% of the audience here. So it's spot on. But again, we now have the technology that allows us to do that.
So do you feel like more organizations will start, just with AI is getting pretty good at doing the diagnostic and getting that faster. Does that enable us to get faster into predictive and then prescriptive? Is that the natural kind of flow?
Absolutely. And we also should think about it in a sense of not everything needs to be predictive or prescriptive.
Sure.
Right. So we need to look at it from a more of a pragmatic perspective, right? Where just looking at what happened is enough, right? So sometimes that's the answer, but for which areas that are very complex that we need to be prescriptive, right? So looking at the type of the spend, the type of the sourcing events based on the levels of risk, strategic importance, and then determining what kind of support and analysis that it will require. So we just did this poll. So again, this validates what we just said, right? Descriptive analytics are the most common right now, right? And we are looking that in the next, in next year, next 3 years. So another comment I wanted to make about the predictions time frame, right? So we typically look at things, 2 to 3, 5 years. I think in the last couple of years, we were like, okay, let's look at 3 years instead of 5 years. So last week, we were at our Hackett Leadership Forum with our clients, and one of the questions was, well, it was a comment, I think that's too long. So the 3 years is too long. So we should be looking at a different number because of how fast the technology is evolving and how better it's becoming, right? So I would probably cross over 3 years and, replace it with, next 12 months or next 18 months and relook at that at a rolling forecast period, right? Seeing, okay, with the changes of the technology, what can we start looking at? Where can we actually be prescriptive and predictive where necessary? And again, the questions would be, well, who's going to do that? Well, that's the CoE, your transformational CoE would be responsible for supporting this type of an activity. Well, so the maturity, right? So the top activities that we're looking from a maturity perspective, again, so emerging CoEs are looking at more supplier performance relationship management, right? Digital procurement, innovation, enablement new technology, right? So everything that we talked about, where you start with maybe some basic reporting, knowledge management, some basic analytics, and you really elevate it to more advanced analytics where it's becoming, more of a true capability versus a service that you're delivering, right?
And so, Kate, just to make sure, I want to make sure everyone understands this slide. When you say those on the left, the mature, are you saying that most CoEs that have already are very mature in those activities, and the ones that are the emerging, that's where kind of the next gen CoEs are kind of starting to focus their efforts?
Yeah. So you're building upon, right? So you start maybe, and we talked about, there was a question about POs and, category management, right? So as a step, maybe 0 step of maturity, you're trying to kind of maybe centralize that and provide some best practices there, right? How to do procurement better, right? When you get to the actual maturity, that's where you're starting to deliver these services on the right? The mature, right? These are on the left-hand side. This is probably a makeup of your traditional CoE, right? Yep. But then as you grow and evolve, then you start adding more and more areas, right? It doesn't mean that you're giving up. It's just changing. Your negotiations, you're not helping the negotiations. You're providing AI to do autonomous negotiation, or you're providing market intelligence for that, right? Risk management, right? So, and then you're eventually evolving in that top of the pyramid, right? Where you're driving project and continuous improvement. It sounds very vague, but if you think about in the first slide, when we had that demand management and value revenue creation, well, those are unique individual projects that CoE would be driving. Yeah. And it's going to vary based on your specific organizations, your enterprise strategy, right?
Kate, I'm about to, I want to add one thing here because I was looking at the supplier performance relationship management one, and we have a customer here at Graphite, Columbia Sportswear, and I'm heading up to Portland to their headquarters here next week, which will be a very fun little trip for me. But one of the things that was really interesting as I've been chatting with them, they have had a performance management program in place in their indirect side of their procurement team for a few years now. And they're starting to move a lot more of it into their direct line of business now, right? And the direct line of business is learning from, even though they don't have a COE per se, but they have someone who's operating as a COE specifically on this project, right? And what was interesting was it kind of references back to that slide of change management. It takes a long time. It's not necessarily fast to help drive the performance management as a program. It does have to, he was like, we have to start it as a pilot and grow it, because once they see the value, they understand we're not trying to take the relationship away. We're not trying to get in and try to get our hands into their relationship with their vendor, their supplier, which they value as a business leader, but more, they can deliver value. The procurement team can deliver value that they hadn't even known existed before. And we're talking, this is, a large multi-billion-dollar company, a household name, and they have people working there who have never had supplier performance management before. They've never encountered it in their career, right? So on this emerging side, I think a lot of it too goes back to the change management of, as we evolve the COE, how do we make sure that the COE is educating the internal stakeholders on what a COE really is helping to drive now? What is procurement really going to deliver for them? Because it's a mindset shift internally in the procurement organization, but it has to be a company-wide shift of how they see the COE as well, and goes into that procurement brand and marketing as well.
Yeah. Well, and then, so I always say, right, the most important thing is to have supplier performance and relationship management. Who actually does it? It doesn't matter as long as you have it, right? Yeah. And COE could be a light touch knowledge center at this point, just enabling the business, because a lot of times the business is more equipped to do SRM activities, right? As long as they're doing it, and they're already doing it. So you have pockets of excellence. So from COE perspective, they're just creating visibility in that space. Maybe they're not doing it. They're reporting on it. They're gathering insights. They're combining their relationship management performance with their supplier risk performance and seeing, if there's opportunities or how do we mitigate risks. So again, you have to think about it, the evolution of being pragmatic, right? Where is the business need, right? And what do they need, and how can COE help them the most? And we get to our next polling question. So in terms of the role of the COE, what should be the primary role of your COE over the next 2 to 3 years?
I think this will be a really interesting one, Kate. I don't know if you have any predictions as they come in.
I'm always wrong, so I'm going to say AI and analytics. But process standardization and governance is important, right? Because again, we need to start thinking about it not from the steps of how to get to the outcome, but what outcome we want, what results do we want, and then designing the ways to get there, right? Versus start thinking about, okay, I used to do these 5 steps. How do I automate these 5 steps? But let's see. I think AI is going to be your number one.
Right. I think we got most of the answers in, so I'm going to share the results here. But you were right, Kate. I'm not shocked at all that you were right. You were right. We got the driving transformation, AI, advanced analytics, innovation. But what I think is really interesting here, though, is that, again, it goes back to the priorities, that number one being data, right? Like, how do you even know which processes to go and work on and standardize? Like, it's almost like this cycle I think about with the COE, where data and analytics, you are responsible for helping create those to help drive the business, right? And give them the insights they need to be better category managers, to be better sourcing managers, right? But then it's also that continual improvement that you talked about on that emerging slide, right? Like the project and continual improvement. Well, processes, you're not going to, especially in today's age, you're not going to create a process right now and it's going to survive and it's going to be the same a decade from now. I think that that's so like your COE is not going to be able, the business can't sustain that lack of agility, right? But how do you understand which processes need standardization or need better governance, or the processes that are becoming bottlenecks? Like, how do you get that? Well, you have to go back to that data foundation and the analytics and insights in order to know what projects the COE. So it's this cycle of they're going to create the data that gives them the projects that helps them deliver the result that will be reflected in the data that helps them understand, right? The continuous cycle.
Okay, well, I know we're almost out of time and we want to leave a few minutes for questions. But again, I just want to kind of close out on the key messages, right? So the value, I think it's really important to understand what value, what is the output we need to have, right? So again, we always look at it from let's automate a bunch of steps, but now let's change our thinking about what outcome do we need? What value are we getting? Right. So again, most valuable people are going to be the ones that use an AI. That's not a surprise. People have been saying that for years, right? Focusing your energy where you can add value, right? Thinking the results. And again, being comfortable with just your legacy skills is a huge risk, right? So think about how you can make your organization super negotiators, super procurement professionals, and enable those individuals with the right tools. So, and that's, the foundation here is the CoE. Data is definitely important, the insights that the data provides. And I'll leave it at that, and we can open it to some questions.
We had one here from Mark, and it's more of a comment than a question, but we've had a lot of pullback from transformation to standardization after a big global merger. We're trying to maintain momentum on transformational efforts, but capacity is a challenge. And CoE is owning that merger standardization. Like, Kate, is there a way to do both? Like, can you standardize and transform at the same time?
Well, I think that's part of it. That's part of the equation, right? Look at it from the, like white space. Let's figure out how we're going to do this differently, right? What are we trying to accomplish and how we're going to do this differently? And that's going to be like the driver of the transformation, is saying, okay, well, do I need these 5 steps for approvals? Why do I need that? Do I need that? Right? Do I have the data to validate that? So
there's another really good question here, Kate. And this is Ravi Kumar asked this a little bit earlier on, but I didn't have the quite right time to ask it. So I'm going to bring it back to a second to our conversation on AI. If companies investing in best of breed solutions for source to contract or P2P are consolidating to a single platform, why should they invest in orchestration over top of it? Isn't it expected that the new solution will bring these capabilities natively? So, where do you orchestrate your process? Where should you build your process? Where should the CoE look? Is it building best of breed, or is it looking at a one-stop shop? How do we add more, how do we eliminate some of the complexity and cost there and decide where should the AI live?
Well, that's the fundamentals of your build or buy decision, right? Where, so, if you are, Coupa or Reba House, you're going to have the orchestration already there, right? And you can decide how you want to approach it, right? If you're choosing best of breeds, then you would have your orchestration layer, in a different way, or maybe using one of those, right? Some organizations decide to build their own orchestration layer, so that way they can swap out technology underneath and there is no impact to change management to their end users, right? They also control their data that way. So again, it really depends into the size of your company, right? Your level of support from, how much support IT is going to help you, how much your CoE is able to be, to be funded, right? So if you're, one man or woman CoE team, probably, you're probably going to lean towards buying and relying on IT. If you're a multi-billion-dollar company and you have resources for your CoE, then decision gets a little bit better. But I think it's, again, I think I've stole this from somebody else where I said we should approach this decision how we approach workforce, right? Which activities are definitely should be done internally, like where we want to have full control. We want to, shape these individuals, agents, right, or technology, and where can we want to rent or buy it, right? And then have a layer and then decide, okay, well, are we going to buy our layer? We're going to use the existing layer. We're going to make our own. But these are all really great questions, but it looks like we're out of time, but feel free to connect with me and I'm happy to continue this conversation. Obviously, I don't know all the answers, but it is super interesting having these discussions with some of the global leaders.
Absolutely. And just a quick reminder as we wrap up today, there will be a copy, the download on demand of video of the webinar is available for viewing. You'll get an email on that automatically in your inbox. Also, we will be sending out slides and following up. If we didn't get to your question today, don't worry about it. We can always get your question over to Kate afterwards. She's lovely and wonderful. I'm sure would be happy to answer anything. And then just one last final plug, because Kate, I think that question teed me up perfectly for the next Graphite webinar that we haven't even announced yet, is coming in July. And it's all about MCP servers. And I think that's a really interesting thing. If you're thinking about orchestration on top of orchestration and how do which AI does what where in my tech stack, because everyone has some sort of AI capability now. You might not have ever heard the term MCP server, but tune into that one because I think that's a really interesting one for painting the art of the possible and thinking about how can LLMs interact with my data. So thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Kate, so much. This was so valuable. I love all the Hackett research slides. I feel like I could spend 10 years on them. They're all just so interesting. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.